Hey, Alma. Okay, we'll start shortly. Give me 1 minute. Share screen. Okay, so you'll be able to find your final review here on Canvas under week 14. And then I'll post the video here when we have the recording tonight. Okay. So I'll get that up and running. Okay, so you can check out the assignment and download it. We'll go over it. Okay, so this is going to cover chapter 1 through 17. Final exam is going to be 50 questions, multiple choice, 4 point each. Okay. And lockdown browser. I will release password and information about the exam on the Monday, December 13th. And for this class, you have until the 16th to finish. So 11:59 on 11/16 or December 16th, it's going to close. So make sure that we get all the stuff in before then. Okay. And then any late work needs to be in by the 5th. Okay. So first question, what type of network does not have a dedicated server in which each node has equal roles in sharing and receiving information, and that is a peer-to-peer network? Compared to client server, everybody has equal role in sharing and accessing resources. Okay. For 2, ABC Tech has offices in San Francisco and Los Angeles. These networks are connected to share resources and data. What type of network is used to connect both locations of the company? So since geographically it is far, we are going to use wide area network, which belongs to service provider and other entities. So wide area network for 2. For 3, what type of, sorry, sometimes I type fast, my hands is not as fast as my mind. But what type of server is used to store files for users on the network? Let me highlight this so I can come back to the student file and fix it. That will be file server, and we can use different type of file server, but commonly you would have FTP, or if you want to have the user authenticate, you can also use FTP, but we want to use secure way to transfer file. Number 4, fill in the blank. The blank is a physical layout of computers, cables, other components on the network, and that's a topology. It is a network layout that contains all your systems and connection. The logical topology would entail your IP addresses and network segment, where the physical topology only includes your systems and cabling. Okay. For number 5, which type of topology has a centralized location in which all of the cables are connected in the central point, such that a failure at this point can bring down the network? That will be a star. And make sure we know our topology: bus star, mesh, ring, right? Hybrid, For question 6, there are 3 switches connecting to a network segment. The systems that are connected to a second switch cannot communicate to the rest of the network. What could be the problem? So that means that the second switch is connecting to other switches, right? And that means that possibly the crossover cable is not being used. Remember, when we have device to the device, if they're the same type of device, we are going to connect using crossover cable. Question 7. What type of cables send signals as pulses of light through a glass core? That will be your fiber optic cable. Fiber optic uses glass, and we can have LED or LCD, or I'm sorry, LED or laser. And for fiber optic, right, we worked on using OptiCam. So fiber optic is used to transmit fast signal and also reliable, and it doesn't have too much interference compared to copper. For Network Plus and final exam, we need to know the base network. So in a 100 base T network, what type of cable is used? What is the speed of the network? So for the 100 base T, the 100 stands for the speed. So that will be 100 megabit per second. The base T stand for twisted pair. So it would use copper twisted pair, and that will be your Cat5 to transmit signal up to 100 megabit per second. That won't be Cat5e, it's only going to be Cat5 because Cat5e and Cat6 is in the gigabit. Question 9. What type of fiber optic cable has a maximum distance of 2 kilometers? And that is going to be your single mode fiber optic. Remember, single mode is able to span over longer distance than multi-mode. So 2 kilometers is going to be single mode fiber optic. And then under that, you also have other categories under single mode, right? What type of fiber optic cable has a maximum distance of 300 meters? And that will be your multi-mode fiber optic. Multi-mode. So often you would find fiber optic connecting floor to floor if they don't use old school copper, right? But the modern way is to use fiber optic floor to floor in a tall rise building or building to building. For number 11, what type of access method is used in 100 base T networks to allow hosts to send data on a free wire connection? This is known as carrier sense multiple access with collision detection. CIS40A. Likely that you will see this on Network Plus. It's been around forever since I've been in the field. Carrier sense multiple access with collision detection, CIS40A. The nature of this industry is to remember a lot of acronyms. Okay. But if you use it often enough, you remember. Hey, how are you doing? We're just going over the final. I'll wait for you. If you missed the first part, we'll come back to that. Okay. So in the beginning of the book, it talks about fiber optic, and then later on, it talks about fiber optic. So the beginning of the book mainly addressed cabling, devices, network types, and so on. So you can refer to notes of the chapters to review more if you like. Okay. 412. What type of cables is used in 1,000 base SX network? So whenever you see the X in there, you know that it is fiber optic. Download the file, Michelle. We'll wait for you. And when you see SX, you should know that this is a multi-mode fiber optic cable. Okay, where the LX is the single mode. So we want to keep remembering it until it becomes second nature. Because what you see nowadays is everybody's mostly integrating fiber optic in their network for higher throughput. So the 1,000 stand for 1,000 megabit per second. So we're in the giga, and when you're in the giga, right, you would use the later categories like Cat5e, Cat6. If it's copper, but since it's, you see the X in there, you know it's fiber optic. So SX and LX are the fiber optics. Remember we had that in our lab. Any question? Is there the meaning it to the L and the LX and S and the SS? Yes, there is, David. I can't remember exactly what they actually mean, but you know, the IEEE, they specified that. I think if you, one second, let me find if I reference it in lab 12. If you look at lab 12, I think it's table. Yeah, it didn't specify it. But if you look closely, right, the LX can also mean multi-mode. It's actually referring to the diameter, so they combine them, both of them in each category, right? And this is coming from the IEEE website. So the author of the textbook or even Network Plus, they might only look at like the 100 base T and they reference that, but I feel like the multi-mode and see this LX also combine multi-mode. So SX is multi-mode only. Okay, that's 850 nanometer. But sorry, I can't come up with the, I'm assuming it has something to do with the way it's sending signal, right? Like simplex, duplex, and all of that. So. Okay. Other questions? Okay, so we talked about 12. For 13, a blank is a network language used by two systems to communicate across the network. It consists of a set of rules for formatting and processing data. And that is a definition for protocol, or in our case, since it's for network, it's a network protocol. And protocol is always tied to services and ports. All right. For 14, what type of non-routable protocol is used in Microsoft Workgroup environment? And that is your NetBEUI. Since NetBEUI came before the implementation of IP addresses, it was used to be able to set up a workgroup environment. So by default, your Windows 10 and your Windows system is put everybody on workgroup, which is a way to reference peer-to-peer environment where all the nodes are equal in roles. But right, we can implement client server type of network by using domain, and that's when you add the domain. For 14, we are talking about 14. 15, identify two protocols that operate at the network layer of the OSI model. That one is easy. So when you think about network, you should think about routers. And when you think about network OSI layer, you should think about IP and ICMP. So the router works with IP addresses, bless you, where the switch works with MAC addresses. So that means MAC address is at layer 2, IP address is at layer 3, therefore IP, Internet Protocol, is functioning at layer 3. So when you ping, you use ICMP because you ping an IP address, right? It's connectionless. So that means that ICMP is functioning at layer 3 because it needs the router to route your ping packets. Okay, so all of these are all related. 16, we need to identify two protocols that operate in the transport layer of the OSI model that are responsible for packets delivery. So this is connection oriented, right? Or when we're looking at transport, it needs to get the packets to the right destination. So TCP does that, and UDP doesn't care how the packets arrive, but it makes it there. So TCP and UDP in the transport. There are other protocols. I think in the notes, I included a list of protocols for each of the layer. You see a picture of it. Make sure that we remember this for network class. 17, which layer of the OSI model is responsible for converting packets into electrical signal? So that will be your data link layer 2, right? Packets exist in layer 3. Data frame exists in layer 2. So, and in order to go down to the physical layer, we have to convert it to electrical signal, which is then be encapsulated at the network interface card, which is the physical layer. So the cable, right, your NIC, how the bits are received at the NIC and the cable, that will be your physical. How it's being an electrical signal and frame the data, that will be layer 2. And then preparing that for packets. Packets is going to be layer 3. Move some of the space up. 18, which standards define 10 gigabit Ethernet? And whenever you hear Ethernet, you should think about 802.3. So make sure that we start remembering standards. It's so important that you do. Okay. So standards define is defined by IEEE, and for the 10 gigabit Ethernet, that will be your 802.3 AE. AE. And then 19, which wireless standards allow the system to transfer data at 54 megabit per second and operate on the same frequency as 802.11b. So whenever that you see that the standards operate on the same frequency, that means it's compatible, right? Like the A is compatible with N, where G is compatible with B because the frequency is the same. So that will be your 802.11G, and G is compatible with B, but it has B was functioning at 11 and 54 megabit per second, where G is functioning at 54 megabit per second. And then they improved that by introducing M, which allows you to transfer at 600 megabit per second. And then AC is a lot faster. Okay, so 802.11 belongs to Wi-Fi. Oops. All right. 20. What type of network device receives data on one port and send the same data out to other ports? So when it broadcasts like this, that will be a hub, because the hub is not smart. It doesn't know where the destination is. It's kind of like you give me a present to give to someone, and I don't know who to give it to, so I announce it to everybody. I said, I have a present. I will give it to whoever claims it. Right? So that's what the hub does. It's a passive hub. It doesn't know which port, so it just sends it to everyone. 21. What type of network appliances is used to extend the length of signal when a maximum length of the cable is reached? So you would use a repeater. Now you can also use a coupler, but the coupler doesn't it doesn't keep the entirety of the signal, right? You have degradation in signal when you use a coupler. So what I'm talking about coupler is like you attach a cable with another cable using a coupler. It's an adapter that you would hook the two cables together. You can extend that way, but what happens is when your maximum length is reached, your signal becomes less and less. So if I have a 100-meter cable and then I use a coupler and attach it to another 100-meter cable, by the time it reaches the 200-meter, it will be next to no signal, because the maximum signal strength is 100 meter. So you would use a repeater, which takes that signal right at the end and then re-amplify it for the rest. That's why when you see these routers, they call it right signal amplifier. It takes that the entirety of the signal, bless you, and be able to amplify it again. Okay, 22. What type of network appliance receives data and forward it to the destination port in a LAN? And remember, this one's different than the hub in that it does send it to the destination port. It forwards it, right? The switch forwards it to the port. So that will be your LAN. I mean your switch. 23, fill in the blank. The blank is a group of ports on the switch that is assigned to a virtual network. And the question already states it. So you should know that this is a VLAN. We practice this. We have a range of ports. We group them up. We trunk them, and we use Cisco appliance for that, right? Or network appliance, I should say, not just Cisco. 24. What type of network devices send data from one network to another network? And that's your router. So your router is going to be interfacing one network to the next. Okay. You can also say gateway, but not all gateways are routers. What type of device is used for digital communication over digital or conventional phone lines? And that is a modem, right? But in this case, it will be your ISDN modem. So the modem modulates signal. Okay, that means that it needs to convert analog to digital and digital to analog if we're using the phone line. Or even in the case for ISDN, sometimes it is over a digital network, but ISDN networks use ISDN modem. It could be external modem or internal modem. Okay, 26. In a T1 or T3 link, what is used to connect the network to the high-speed WAN link? So now we're entering the ISDN and all of that, right? We would use what's called the CSU-DSU, Channel Service Unit Data Service Unit. It looks like a modem, right? But the difference in the CSU and DSU compared to a modem in that the CSU DSU operates with channel configuration, okay, versus a modem that just passes, it modulates and it passes through. So when you use a tier 1 or a tier 3, the T stands for tier, you would need to use CSU DSU. Somewhere in the world, people are still using ISDN. People still use ISDN for backup connection, which taps over the landline, right? Even though we mostly integrate digital networks and gigabit networks and so on, or faster, right? We still tap into the phone line as a backup, right? Now on the security side, is that a questionable issue? Sure, because some of the old technology is used for landline, and that can impose. So you have to really look at the integration of your backup line and so on. Or sometimes people would use satellite, etc., right? Cell tower for backup and so on. 27. How many B channels are used in BRI connection? What is the speed of a BRI connection? So a BRI connection uses 2 B channels, and each of the channel is 64 kilobit per second. So if you take 2 multiplied by 64, you would have 128 kilobit per second of the total speed. So the dial-up days was when we first started using dial-up, it was slower, and then eventually they standardized it at 56 kilobit per second. Okay, and then they boosted up to 64 kilobit per second, and this is when they start integrating a lot of the ISDN technology. So for home use, sometimes if you pay a little more, you can also get 128 kilobit per second. So when you look at modem technology in the 90s, right, or going toward the end of the 90s, you would find that a lot of the modems are able to have throughput at 128 kilobit per second because the backbone for the service provider was integrated with better technology for higher throughput. 28. What type of addresses is made up of 8-bit octets and 4 8-bit octets? That's your IP version 4 addresses, right? It makes up 32-bit, where we would take octet is 8 bits, okay? And we would multiply it by 4. IPv4 is 32-bit, whereas IPv6 is 128 bits. And then eventually, in the future, we'll have a different form of address when we run out of IPv6, right? It's a lot, but we might still run out. Okay, now we're going to start entering the protocol support and the IP addresses. 29. Using IPv4 addresses, how many hosts does a class B support? So we need to know class A, class B, class C, right? How the subnet or the network identifier and the host identifier. So class B uses network, host. So if you take the first 2 identifier, which are the network, that's 8-bit each, right? If they're all turned on, that gives you 256. 256 times 256, that gives you 65,536 hosts. Sorry, there should be host, I meant these 2. So that means that class A have the most hosts, right? Because it's 256 times 256 times 256 compared to class C, has the least host, which is your home network uses class C, that's going to only be your 256 hosts. And remember, we can't use all 256 either. The beginning and the end are reserved for broadcast, right? And network, so we only have 254 usable IP in class C by default. Okay, so each of the 8 bits represents 256. That's what I'm trying to show you. The default subnet mask for class C IPv4 address is 255, 255, 255.0. Make sure we know default subnet mask for the classes. 31. What port and protocol are used to send email over TCP/IP network? And that will be your SMTP, where IMAP and POP are used for webmail to send and receive webmail. But for if you're using email in the network, that will be your simple mail transfer protocol that uses port 25. 32. Identify the port for the following protocols. Telnet 23, close the port. HTTPS 443. Sometimes they also use 444 for HTTPS, but 443 is commonly known for HTTPS. POP3 110. HTTP easy 80. DNS 53. But make sure we know the others, right? Because in practice, you have in security and networking, you have to know all your port numbers are common. We don't worry about the 4,000 or 5,000, you know, because that's usually like for server type of services. They are less common, so you want to go with the common ones and know them. 33. Identify the protocols and the services based on their functionality. Converting an IP to a MAC, that's your ARP, ARP, Address Resolution Protocol, ARP table. B. Reporting errors and sending back status information over TCP/IP, that's ping, ICMP. Assign IP address to requesting client systems, DHCP. Resolving fully qualified domain name to IP address, DNS. Domain name service. Translate private IP address to public IP address, NAT. Lastly, connect Unix client to remote file system, NFS. It exists in Unix and now still used in Linux. Okay, IPv6. In Windows 8.1 and Windows 10, what is the default link local IP address? So you would see FE080. You see this when you do IPconfig all for the Windows 10 system too, right? So if you enable IPv6, it's gonna use the default link local. This is like your loop back in version 4. So FE80. We have to start getting used to using IPv6, right? I know that when you go into the field, a lot of companies have transitioned to IPv6, but they still use IPv4. We have to start getting used to looking at them. What is the compressed version of IPv6 address, right? FE8000, B596, etc. So when you see the 0 in the middle like that, you truncate them by using the colon. So you can use a double colon or a single colon. Often people would use double colon to compress all those 0. Okay, so you can reduce all of those 0 by using a double colon. Using IPv6, which of the following option is a multicast address? And that's your A. Okay. The B is a global address. C, that doesn't really exist. And F is when it broadcasts, it turns all the Fs on. So A, FF01, always remember that. That's gonna, by default, okay? That's a multicast address. Okay, 37. Determine the appropriate utility based on the following criteria. A, view NetBIOS name table of the system, NVStat. NetBIOS statistic, right? It's so easy. All right, determine the path taken by data packet and its destination, trace route. Modify entry of ARP cache table, ARP, and then you would use the option, right? -A, and so on. View NIC configuration in Windows system, IPconfig /all. Network interface card configuration, that will be IP address, MAC address, DNS, you know, DHCP, all of that. When you right click your Ethernet adapter, that's your network interface card, the property sheet. So when you do IPconfig all, basically you're looking at that in command line. Okay. Identify the appropriate Cisco CLI commands based on the given task. A, move from the user exec mode to priv exec mode. That's your privilege exec mode. You need to do enable. Sometimes you can do en, but type out enable will be fine. B, enable an interface on the device. No shutdown. C, display statistic of the network interface. That's easy. Show interface. And we have to do that on the user exec mode, not the preview exec mode, right? Or the global configuration mode, I should say. All right. Sorry, I'm missing a T here. Enter interface configuration. I have a typo too. In VLAN mode, that will be interface VLAN. Let's fix it. Yeah. And then E. E, set IP address 173.16.0.1 and default subnet mask. That will be IP address 173.16.0.1 255.255.0.0. That's a class B, right? Okay. In Cisco network device, what protocol is configured to prevent network loops? And that's your spanning tree, your STP. And network loops degrade your bandwidth, so it slows down, right? Because when it's looping, you're gonna have poor bandwidth, so we want to use STP. What feature is used on a switch to send a copy of all traffic to a specific port? And this is called port mirroring. '41. Okay, I'm gonna move down a little more now. Network address 131.17.0.0 is used to create 6 subnets. What is the default subnet mask? What is its new subnet mask? So the default subnet mask is, because it's class B, that will be 255.255.0.0. And the new subnet mask will be 255.255.224.0. And practice, right, the handbook that I gave you for subnetting, and also look at my notes for that chapter. Okay, 42. A network is divided into 8 subnetworks. How many bits are taken from the host ID of the subnet mask? So if we take an entire network and divide it into 8, the equation is 2 to the n equal number of subnets. So 2 to the n is equal to 8. And so we want to find n, that will be 3, right? If we take 2, raise it to the 3rd power, we'll have 8 networks. So your mask bits represents the n. (43) In binary, how do you calculate broadcast and network ID of a network range? For the broadcast address, we would calculate it by converting all the host bits to 1. Remember, when they're all 1s, they're 255. For the network address, we would convert all the host bits to 0, right? For example, 173.16.0.0, or for number 41, that's a network address. So 131.17.00. So the first 2 octets are the network bits, and then the host becomes all 0. Okay. Okay, 44. What type of notation is used to identify network ID in an IP version 4 address? That's called the CIDR, and that stands for classless interdomain routing. And it would be something like this, right? Let's see, 173.617.0.0. It can be slash, right? We want to indicate the default. That will be 16. So the example would be, so your CIDR is this part right here. That will just be the bits that represent the network ID. So if it's using borrow bits, right? Like if we're subnetting, that will be slash something else instead of 16. It could be 18 if it's borrowing 2 bits, 20 if it's borrowing 4 bits into the host, and so on. 45. In a DNS, what type of records is used to reference host name to an IPv4 address and IPv6 address? That will be your A record is used to reference a host name to an IPv4, and a quadruple A record is used to reference host name for IPv6. So when you set up your for lookup zone, right, in your DNS, and we did that, when you put in the IP address as version 4, it creates an A record. But if you enable IPv6 and you tell it that you are going to use this IP version 6 address, it's going to enable quadruple A record. And that's how it's able to resolve name to IP through that file. In a network, what service and feature allow all internal system to access the internet using one public IP, and that's called NAT overloading and port address translation. So when you like in your home, your router acts as a NAT, your wireless router, and it does NAT overloading. So it takes all your devices that use different private IP address, combine it, right? No matter which device it is, it's still going to use that one public IP when it leaves your network. And it does the port translation in the case where it has to pinpoint which device is communicating. Yeah. You have to configure, well, you can set. Do you have two different public IPs? No, I have one. I did the yeah. Yeah, they because no matter what happens, your router is still gonna push it as one. So if you set it on NAT on both of the machines, it doesn't matter where, you know, how the private IP is, it's still gonna route out as one public IP because you only have one. But in the case when you have two public IP, right, two routers, then all you set route. So you basically tell the system, right, that this system to that router is going to be one route, and the second system to the router is another route. That's going to route out and come back the same. So on your router, you have to set the NAT configuration for that system and then how it routes out to a certain public IP. So, okay, all right. 47, what feature in virtualization environment is used to define different networks through software and dynamically assigned to virtual machines? That's known as your software-defined networks. I know if you took 30B with me, we touched on this and we wrote script about this. So you use a software to be able to control, right, your systems. And SDN is often used with cloud systems, right, like Azure and AWS. So you would see it on cloud as well. 48, what is the data transfer rate for 802.11n standard? That's 600 megabit per second. What is the transfer rate for Bluetooth? Roughly 1 gig. Okay. Different classification for 802.5, not 0.3 or 0.5. So 0.5 is the Bluetooth. I don't know why I can't remember all these standards from way back when. I think I was just curious about it. All right, 50. What type of communication protocol is used to make connection over serial interface to a remote network? That's your SLIP, your serial line internet protocol. To connect, let me scroll down a little. To connect to a virtual private network, what is used to establish tunnels alternatively to dial-up? So moving from dial-up, we have PPTP, which is still incorporated in most of the VPN server today. You saw this when you configure it. 52, true or false? In a packet switching network, a failed portion can be routed around the point of failure to continue to deliver the packets. True. True. Depending on the protocols that you use, right? But the whole point in TCP/IP is that we want to make sure that when there's error or failure, it notifies and also it attempts all alternative options to get the packets to the destination. Because if we don't do that, imagine how your internet would be, right? A bunch of errors. What type of speed, what is the speed of Sonnet 1 or OC1? I should put that in here for you. Actually refer to OC1. And Sonnet 3, which is OC3, because that's how Network Plus is going to ask you. OC1 is 51.84 megabit per second. And then Sonnet 3 or OC3, it's triple that. So whenever you see the number after OC, it's a multiplier. So that will be 3 times 51.84, which is 155.52 megabit per second. So if you see OC8 or another number, OC4, it's just a multiplier. Okay, just remember OC1 and you're good. Okay. Where is TCarrier used and where is ECarrier used? And the way that I remember this is E stands for Europe. I always remember that, right? And then for TCarrier, that's us. That's tier 1, tier 2. So your TCarrier is US, Japan, Australia. And your ECarrier is Europe, South America, and Mexico. 55, true or false? ADSL supplies the internet data over the phone line using frequencies below 3.4 gigahertz. False, it's actually above 3.4 gigahertz. So there's SDSL and ADSL, right? Asynchronous and synchronous. Synchronous just means that it downloads and uploads at the same speed, where asynchronous, your upload and download speed are different. Make sure we know that too, because likely that you will be asked about that. Even DSL is, phasing out, but people and business still use DSL in the area that they don't have cable or fiber optic. 56. What should you do before performing upgrade on a software and a hardware? We always want to test updates for compatibility and stability. Okay. So the way that we test it, we can use virtual machines or testing systems. And then you can track the versions. 57, what role is installed on Windows Server system to manage deployment of system updates? And that's your WSUS or Windows Server Update Service. This allows you to manage and redistribute your updates. 58, what is the difference between security hotfixes and service packs? And we learned that service packs consist of security hotfixes and other patches. They can, in service pack, we can install them all together. Microsoft is notorious for doing SME service packs. Now, what they do is they just do releases instead of calling service pack, because it impacts the marketing side of the house. So before, when you see like Server 2012 R2, right, it's released 2. They fix all the issues with the release 1. And they kind of phase out some of that, but some software companies still use it. When troubleshooting on the network, what is the last step? So make sure we know the troubleshooting step. It's the same as A+ as Network Plus. Document findings, actions, and outcomes. So you identify the problem, you come up with the theory for the cause, right? You test the theory and then implement solutions. You test implemented solutions, then you document. All right, now the last part, which is on the last few chapters, is on security, which is really easy for us, right? Most of you have taken 27. What type of attacks use fake website emails, text messages to obtain sensitive data, passwords, and account information? That's your phishing with the PH. What type of attack uses multiple systems to attack a single target system and overwhelms the system with massive requests? That's your distributed denial of service attack. So Network Plus now asks these type of questions, security questions. So make sure you know them, kind of like the Security Plus, but not so advanced. It really focused on protecting networks. So make sure we know the malware and the attacks. What type of malware is activated by a certain event or logic? And I put the word logic in there to give you the hint. So that's your logic bomb. So that it could be activated by a certain date. So when that date becomes true, that's how they program it, right? It's going to activate. It's going to, let's say, delete files or modify system configuration and so on. Okay. True or false? Anti-malware is used on the network with scheduled updates and scan. No, false. It should always run live. So we have to run live updates and scan. Because you have people that bring their devices to work and their device could be infected. So if you do schedule scan, infection would spread in the time that you did scan. So you have to do live scan. And it should always be running. Back in the day, we would say, oh, we'll just schedule the scan. But now, not anymore. That's not the practice anymore. Wow, I have my Yep. So depending on how heavy you use your network, so if your network is heavily used for internet reasons, right? Downloads and stuff like that, I would do live scan. The thing with our system is that it's resource intensive when it scans, right? So in the larger network, when they do live scan, they can, they have the resources for that. But on the smaller network, when you do scan, it kind of slows things down for your applications and things like that. So that's why people schedule scan. But if you heavily use, like, if you distribute files and things like that, I would scan regularly, right? Every day. Okay. All right. What protocol allows multiple login methods, which is often used in remote authentication, dial-in user service radius? That's your extensible authentication protocol, your EAP. It uses multiple methods for login. What Windows security subsystem component is a database file that contains user password, and this is your SAM. So my video, I talk about net login and win login and all of these processes that happen. Network Plus expect you to know the process for authentication, and not only that, other certification also does too. But that really shows how you would know access control is to really understand how access token is generated. Okay, so look at the last notes and it goes into the detail of the subsystem. All OS have some kind of subsystem for authentication. All right, 66, fill in the blank. The blank is a list of users groups that's allowed to access an object based on permissions granted. That will be your access control list. Okay, 67, true or false. In a system, permissions are users' abilities to perform tasks in the OS. False. That's user rights or privileges. So in Windows, they refer to that as user rights, but in other systems, they refer to privileges. Okay, so make sure that we know the difference. Permissions are for files, folders, and other objects. 68. What type of encryption uses public key and private key pair to encrypt and decrypt data? That is your asymmetric key encryption. And a type of algorithm that uses asymmetric key is RSA. Okay. Or it should also be referred to as PKI, public key infrastructure. So many names. Right. 69. In a network, how should you set the firewall rules to filter inbound, outbound traffic? You should set the rules based on IP address, port, protocols. And that is really to support the deny and allowance of your services. Because in order to establish a service, they have to connect, and they connect to the port, and they connect to the system, so IP, and then the protocol would provide services as it formats the data for that, right? Okay, 70. Which encryption standard replaced triple DES? It is a block cipher that supports 128-bit, 192-bit, and 256-bit encryption. That is your advanced encryption standards. AES. This is now commonly used in mobile devices, portable devices, systems, wireless. 78. How would an administrator achieve high network availability? Right? There should be 5 nines. Sometimes 7 nines. That's what they want. So in cyber and security, we always strive. Also, availability is overlooked in the security area, right? But the network is we want to achieve the 99.9999%. So we want to use failover cluster to ensure critical system communication consistently available and increase network performance availability through load balancing and securing your resources. So securing covers a lot of things like having backup, disaster recovery plan, train your users, so many other things that falls under security. That's why the cybersecurity area is much needed because there's so many things to do. 72. What type of physical security should be implemented in the organization? This is easy, right? We should have fencing. And in the book, it talks about how you should use, barbed wire and so on. But there are a lot of different type of fencing out there. We should use door locks, entrance logs, CMOS settings to protect our physical computer, fire extinguisher for the system, surveillance, server room physical access control. We can go on, humidity management, right? And etc. So those are the things that you need to derive in a plan. If you do a business continuity plan, you're going to talk about physical protection. 73. What type of firewall uses a screening router to monitor internal network and isolate a certain internal network? So the key words there is isolation. When you use Subnet, you can segregate your network segment and isolate it. So you can use a router to screen. Okay. So this is the book called the Screen Subnet Firewall, but I've heard different names for it. So it's fine. We can use Screen Subnet Firewall. It's easier for you to remember as we talk about isolation. So when we use screening like this, we would screen for inbound and outbound traffic because the router actually routes everything, right? It is a gate to other subnets. So we want to make sure that we can specify in our router, right? So it can either route out or it can block it there. That's why they do an all-in-one devices now quite frequently. So lastly, the 274, what approach is used to control which system can communicate with the network by separating systems on the network logically? That will be your network segmentation. And 75, what protocol and service should be RU, sorry, to remotely monitor network devices? That's your SNMP. Use version 2. Okay. But the older system would have version 1. I want to also talk a little bit about network design a little bit, and as we kind of touch on the firewall, because it's really important that you understand that going into the security area or administration of network. The flaws is a lot of the time is in the design, and you can't rip things out of the wall to really redesign it. So usually people just add appliances and logically reconfiguring the network. So we need to talk about the logical side. Okay, give me 1 second. Let me pull up the notes for this, and I want to go to the last part. So in unit 13, it talks about some of the practices, right? Like putting things where, now we know that physically all of your appliances are going to be on a rack, right? Or racks in different, it could be a headquarter office or etc. So when you configure this, you have to visualize on how you want your traffic to flow and what kind of protection that you need. Okay, so in this layout, what you have is you have a DMZ which exists between 2 firewalls. Okay, it would look like this. So now, why do we actually have a DMZ here? Because we want to support web, right? Like IIS or web server or Apache. We want to support customer accessing our website for e-commerce reasons or whatnot. So connecting to it, you would have a firewall that protects the traffic for the DMZ. That means that usually they would use an application-based firewall here, okay? Because web server tends to be tied with database. Then on the internal side, you have an edge firewall here, and this is where you want traffic to be stopped, right? Coming into your network if they are harmful. Okay. So this firewall is meant to be a secondary way to stop additional malicious traffic. Now on the LAN side, we also need to put an intrusion prevention system inside. Okay. So when you configure that, what happens is you have to let it pass through your firewall and your router, and internally that everything on the inside, so your IPS and your IDS should be connecting to a switch, right? Before it uplinks it to your router. Okay. So if we visualize this on top of the rack, right, we would have your router, uplink switch, okay, and then the rest of your internal network will be following. Okay, like your baby switches, line that's connecting in, and all your computers connecting to those. But the firewall would then be after, right? So if you want the screen router, then what you need to do is you put the router before the firewall. But if you want the firewall to be protecting before it hits the router, then you have the traffic coming in from WAN connecting to the firewall and then the router. Okay. But now we just use an all-in-one device. A lot of the times you would see a router that acts as a firewall. So you just set up the rules there. And when you configure that router, you just all go to command line and just configure the rules for it. Okay. then it talks about the dual home host here. And so that kind of give you a little bit of a general idea, but you know, maybe in the advanced class, if I do teach you guys, I'll show you some of my former students. So I used to make them design like the entire network with full-blown security, and they draw like everything, right? Because if I'm gonna vouch for you to go out in the field, I want to make sure you can engineer a network. Because and a lot of them became engineered to networks and then became security people down the line. But so they have to draw the logical layout. So when you start seeing that, you're gonna start visualizing how your network should be. So I encourage you to look at some of the network layout, like on Draw.io and some of the other tools, and start seeing how, you know, how people place their firewall, what would be the downside. So when you do security evaluation, that's a good way to start looking at your network defense and things like that. Okay, so on this one, you see how they have the screening router before the screening firewall, and then your another screening router, and then your internal network. Now the downside of this is right here. What's the flaw in that? The third one on the bottom here. What's the flaw in this design? It's highly protecting from coming in, right? Like if I get attacks from China, it's definitely going to try to screen that before. It's kind of like having 3 gates to your house. What happens? Are you going to have high throughput? It's going to bottleneck right there because I have to pass through this to go here, and the same way back. Okay. So you have to look at how you would load balance that. Because if I have a single system here, right, to push everybody in and out, and then another system to screen everybody and another system to screen everybody, that's going to create some issue there. It's going to slow. Okay. So there's give or take. Either you have high security, right? So there's always a risk that we have to take. We're going to have slow network and super protected. So we have to find a solution to improve that network. So if it was up to me, right, I would do a screening router firewall, and I'm going to internally filter inside and segment. And then you can also set up load balancing on, you know, all your switches. Instead of using one switch, you can use multiple switches, and it's going to offset it. So it takes that and distribute it to 3 or 4 or 5. But, you know, that's just a lot of times we buy boxes to really compensate for, you know, because we want fast, higher throughput or security, right? So either you filter it down to one box, or you buy more boxes to be able to configure that to have higher throughput. There's always a discussion on, you know, which way is the right way. There's not really a right design in these type of solutions. It's what you have to work with, and the amount of money you have is ultimately it's going to come down to. Okay. So I encourage you to start looking at how you would design a network. Okay. Use those tools to draw. That's going to make it better, and then you can wow employers, or you can put that on your resume and be able to do that to kind of just, you know, expand your skill, because you don't want to be a tech forever. You don't want to be just a support or even a security technician forever. Okay, any question? All right. So this concludes our final review. And then if you missed the beginning, I guess I can share screen and bring it back up. And then if you're done with everything, I hope you have a wonderful holiday or celebration with your family or not. Just relax. And hope to see you in the future classes. Final exam will be posted the last week. Okay. I'll try to catch up real grade in the next few days. Let me stop recording real quick too.